Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today, as I always am, but even more excited to be here today. I am here with Connie Siskowski, and you'll understand why I'm excited about this as we go along. So Connie is based here in Boca Raton, Florida, just a little bit south of where I am, in Boynton Beach. And she's originally from the New York metropolitan area. Now, I came across Connie and just sort of happenstance. I had been talking about caregiving, of course, as we know, and there's always been this thing inside me of I really wish that young folks were included in this conversation. And little did I know that Connie was the founder of an organization that focuses on Caregiving Youth. The name of the organization now is the American, make sure I get this right, it's the American Association of Caregiving Youth. But it started out as the Boca Raton Interfaith in Action, and then changed over to Volunteers for the Homebound and Family Caregivers, and then ultimately to AACY in 2010. So welcome, Connie. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Todd. I'm excited too.
Oh, great, great. And just a disclaimer for the audience that very recently, this was after I had met Connie and talked about being on the podcast, I have become a member of the National Advisory Council for AACY, and I am extremely excited about that. And Connie and I will be working together to bring this even further to the forefront of caregiving youth. So I'm going to let Connie share a little bit about her background and her education, and I know she has a nursing degree and so forth. So Connie, share a little bit about that.
So yeah, probably out of the caregiving that I did for my grandfather, I went on to become a nurse. And interestingly enough, I specialized in cardiac nursing, and he in fact had died of congestive heart failure. So it's kind of, interesting how the journey goes on. And so, yeah, I did critical care and did so much throughout the healthcare spectrum, everything from teaching paramedics to hospital administration. I got my nursing home license prior to moving to Florida. And I never really realized about the role of children in caregiving until I went to the first international conference on family caregiving in London back in 1998.
How did this evolve? Tell us a little bit about the evolution to get to AACY.
So yeah, I guess I've always been into problem solving, right? So when I was doing home care, there was a woman who was caring for her mom, and she worked, and her mom had multiple conditions, but she was essentially bedbound. And so to get her to the doctor's office, it took a lot. She had to take off from work and get an ambulance. And then, I don't know if you've observed or participated in someone going into a doctor's office in a stretcher, it's not always well received by the other people in the waiting room. And so then that puts off the visits that are important. So I had learned about a company called 1-800-CALL-DOC out of California. And so I contacted them. Bottom line, quick fast forward is I started a company called MDTU to do physician house calls. And that was, I guess, I don't know, in the mid 1990s. And then I went to work then I had to sell that because I had gotten sick. And I went to work for a company called Adult Care. And that was a company owned by Fortis, long-term care insurance. And we dealt with people across the country who were in care. And so I learned through those phone calls to support family caregivers I always remember this one woman who was caring for her mom, and her son was so upset because she had to give attention to her mom rather to him, and he was in high school. So anyhow, and then there was this woman who lived across the street from the city hall in Boca Raton, and we had done a house call on her, and she said she was okay, and all she had was a relative in California, her niece, and she would tell her niece, "I'm fine." And I went to look in her refrigerator because we were giving her some medicine, and her refrigerator was empty, but she was fine. And so that's what happens sometimes when people live alone. And so that was really the birth of Boca Raton Interfaith in Action, to provide volunteer support to people who are homebound and caregiving families. And that happened in 1998. I remarried and went back to school to get my PhD, and had the opportunity to look at to develop a family health section in a county-wide survey that was being conducted by the school district and Palm Beach Atlantic University. So this was the first large study of middle and high school students. And we asked them, was there somebody in their home with a special medical condition? How many were caregiving? And if they were, what was the impact on them? And so out of more than 11,000, more than 4,000 were either missing school, not doing homework, having trouble focusing, or some combination. And I don't know if you have ever experienced it, but I know it's true for the kids, it's true for me, probably true for everybody, that it's really tough to learn when you're under stress. And, this was at a time when the schools were looking at what's wrong with the schools, what's wrong with the teachers. They weren't looking at what's behind um, the students' participation and performance. And so they weren't really ready to do anything, but I shared this information with people I had come to know nationally. And ultimately, we had the first national study, and it was called Young Caregivers in the US. It was released in 2005. And it showed that at that time, there were at least 1.3 million children ages 8 to 18 in that role. That brought some media attention, thankfully. And also, that March, another report was released called The Silent Epidemic, and it looked at young adults who dropped out of school, and 22% said it was to care for a family member. So between the national study, what we had done in Palm Beach County, the media, and then this study, we were able to get funding to begin the first ever Caregiving Youth project in our country. And in the beginning, we called it Young Caregivers, right? Because after the national study, but who is young, you know? And so that's why, people don't think about children in this role. So we quickly had to switch over to something that people could grab onto. And that's why we called it the Caregiving Youth Project.
What would you say is the mission of AACY?
Well, our mission has evolved because it's become bigger through time, but we really champion kids who care for chronically ill, injured, elderly, or disabled family members, to provide them in support of their role as a caregiver so that they can have academic and personal success.
Were there key individuals or organizations that enabled this to help you make this a reality?
Well, we already had the nonprofit in place. And once I had learned about the extent of this, I started meeting with people in the community who joined together. And we got the funding, and then we applied to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and received a 3-year grant to further develop this work.
That's great.
So it's been quite a journey because, we took the data from the original survey in Palm Beach County to look at the schools that had the highest prevalence. And it turned out that Boca Raton Middle School was one of them. People said, Boca Raton, Florida, kids do that there. And actually, and he'll laugh about it today when I went to meet with the principal. I said, your school is in the top 10. And he got all excited, and he didn't know that it was in the top 10 of Caregiving Youth. But he welcomed us. And the principal that followed him actually had a daughter who had a disability, and so he was very familiar with caregiving and its impact. So that allowed us to progress, and we have been embraced by the school district. There have been challenges along the way, of course. Um, who doesn't have challenges, right? We work with the kids in school. We've developed a curriculum, and then we do home visits to see what other things can help the family to reduce the stress on the child. Again, to help that child learn and to have good experiences. And then we do activities that are fun. So right now we're getting ready for our overnight Camp Treasure. And we call it Camp Treasure because we believe that children are a treasure, and to help them discover the treasure within.
I love that. I love that. How is AACY, what is the scalability on a national level?
So as we began to see our outcomes, and when we began, Todd, we didn't know if the kids would want to continue, because we started in middle school, well, they're going to high school, or they're going to want to stay in the program, and they did. And so then we developed relationships with the high school and a curriculum for the high school kids. But well, I think what's most impressive is that our high school graduation rate is 97.9%. And when you look at the population that we serve, and we focused on a lot of Title I schools, so that the children are essentially from financially insecure homes without the resources to hire help at home. But we've never discriminated against income. So, because even if somebody has a substantial income and they can hire somebody to help with tasks and clean the home and do other things, it doesn't mean that the emotional impact is less. And so, the children want to feel normal, and it's a great joy for them to meet other children who are like them, who have these same responsibilities.
I got a sense for that when I was on the call a couple of weeks ago with all of the different students, young caregivers, caregiving youth, and it was phenomenal listening to them, and powerful. I was so moved by just listening to these folks, these young folks, talking about their experiences in life, and just how mature they were in handling this. And I guess when you're in that situation, you're forced into a level of maturity that a child without that responsibility would have.
Right. And and you have to remember that most of the kids that were on that call are receiving some kind of support. So, on the other hand, if you don't, you can get frustrated, you can get angry, you can leave home, when you're able to. And you don't want to go into healthcare. You just want to get out of the house.
That's an excellent point. I'm glad I said it as I did, and you responded like that, because it's an important distinction to make. I know there's the different programs, and we wanted to chat a bit about there's the Caregiving Youth Project and the Caregiver Youth Institute. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure, and I'm sorry I didn't really answer your initial question. Was what about the scalability? And we early on developed a nonprofit franchise model to have affiliates, because once we started sharing our information and our results, people started reaching in. And what we found, though, is because there is no government support for these children, it's very difficult for organizations to support them, because even though what they do mirrors the adult family caregiver, and there are resources for adult family caregivers and recognition. There is yet to be that recognition in our country. And so one of our very first affiliates was in New York, and they kind of started gangbusters, but then when and they were working with a facility that has grandparents raising grandchildren, and so we wanted years later to do a comparison of the children in that facility who were caregivers versus those who were not. And that didn't go forward because the facility receives money for all the kids that they feel that they need to spread evenly, that it's not fair if one group gets more resources and another doesn't. And we had an affiliate in Ohio, and they were with a charter school, and the charter school closed. And then one in Arkansas, and again, they lost their funding. So we know that we're very fortunate, very blessed to be here in Palm Beach County, where people have responded and that we have had resources somehow to keep going and growing. So the Caregiving Youth Institute, we received seed funding from the Schmidt Family Foundation back in 2014. And we decided that it really needed to have 4 components that spell the word care. So one is to connect kids with each other. The A is for advocacy, to help educate legislators. The R is for research, and the E is for education. So we've held like 4 conferences, 1 virtual, 4 in person, to educate others. And we also formed a Caregiving Youth Research Collaborative with professionals from about 12 or so universities in different parts of the country. We're currently working on a white paper that will be published, and also we have an upcoming conference. A lot of juggling. One of our local educational partners is through University of Miami, Miller School of Medicine. Of course, it's not the basketball component of but we've had medical students work with us, do their capstone projects, do their research. We had one do the first ever global study in regarding kids who give medications, and that's been published. We also have a close relationship with UNC Chapel Hill, and they currently have a National Science Foundation grant, and we're looking at mapping what the kids do. They have a GPS, and kids who are caregivers don't get to do all the activities that other kids do, and so this will document that to show another difference, because when you look at the data, caregiving youth show more anxiety and depression, particularly those who are not supported, than those who are non-caregivers.
Did we touch on the youth project, or was that was the Youth Institute?
That was the Youth Institute. So the Caregiving Youth Project is what began at Boca Raton Community Middle School back in 2006. So that has continued into high school. So we're currently in 35 middle and high schools. What's interesting is that the average length of stay of the kids in the program is 5.46 years. So, it's about relationship. It's about, like one boy said to me, I feel like you're in my back pocket, because they need that, so that they don't feel alone. That is so important. We've been able to provide tutoring and respite. There's no respite dollars for kids, and kids need respite too. So we've had a pool of that. We had a boy who complained about his back hurting. And so when we did a home visit, we found out that he and his single mom were needing to lift his brother, who was wheelchair bound, in and out of their single family home, which had a stoop that was high. And so they had to lift him down. His mom worked. She did have a van that was, that she could put her son in. But then our student had to make sure that he was home when his mom got home from work to take his brother into the house. So we found somebody who was able to build a ramp. And that only not relieved their physical pain, but it also allowed him the opportunity to do some things after school. He didn't have to run right home. So, it's those kinds of things, those basic things that these families need that really make a difference.
Absolutely. So to do everything that you accomplish and want to accomplish, how many people work with you in the organization?
Right now we have 11 people who are full-time, and we have 4 people who are part-time. And our family specialists are the ones who are assigned to particular schools, and they're kind of frontline people. They deal with the kids in the school, they do the home visits, they're professional social workers.
How does volunteer shape within the organization?
So that's a great question. So, like, you're a volunteer on the National Advisory Council. Our board are volunteers, and we have about 120 other volunteers who might help in the office. We have a pool of volunteers who are mentors, and we call that program MACY, Mentor at Caregiving Youth. Now, if we could only get Macy's department store to help us, that would be great. But having a mentor really makes a big difference. But, people have to be open to that. And if you're a parent, you might feel threatened if for somebody else to interface with your child. You may not feel as threatened if you're a single mom and you have a son and the son needs a male figure. So, each situation is so different.
Absolutely.
So our volunteers do that, and they also help with fundraising, which is so important.
So let's say somebody watching wants to get involved as a volunteer. How would they go about that?
Well, we have a volunteer application on our website, and we have a manager of volunteers. So they just have to call us, either our 800 number or our office number or online. They can send an email, and then Amanda, who is our volunteer manager, will be in touch with them to see, what they would like to do, because we can't tell a person what to do. You have to have joy when you volunteer.
Absolutely, no question about it. So we talked a little bit earlier about the national scope. Tell us a bit more about the reach of the organization overall, because I know a couple of weeks ago during that event, and I don't know if that was the first time or if that was a repetitive where you were involved with an organization of a similar ilk in the UK.
Yeah, so in the UK, they've been supporting what they call young carers since the mid-1990s. So they're much further along, and they have government support. So they were holding a young carers action day. So we said, well, let's do one here and join up with them. And so they were happy to do that. So Andy McGowan, who's with the Carers Trust, was able to participate in our call. And we had people from, I don't know, close to a dozen different states participating. So our reach is growing. The people are more aware of the issue. And I think one of the things that has been helpful is that the Elizabeth Dole Foundation first did a study with RAND, and then they partnered with Wounded Warrior, who provided funding. And so now they have a group of adults called Hidden Heroes, and then they have children who are caring for someone in the military called Hidden Helpers. And that's really a subset of the whole group of caregiving youth in our country. But they feel like that there's about 2 million of them. And we've really encouraged them to look at the whole family, because it's not just care for the military person, but what if, the the person in the military comes home and now the spouse has cancer, or maybe grandma has moved in and she's had a stroke and the child is still involved. So that child still, is a caregiver. And so having a focus on the whole family, I think, is really critical. But what's been important about that is that Dr. Joe Biden has invited them to the White House. And, the day, I guess it was November 10th of last year, she had a couple of the kids there. And then since then, one of the senators has introduced some legislation, again, on behalf of military families. But, my hope is that maybe that starts to open the door a little bit to be more inclusive.
We can hope. Sure.
Yeah, I do hope.
I
And
do
pray too.
You too. We gotta keep getting the message out there for sure.
Yeah, it's like, if when in Florida we were able to have a question for the first time ever on a statewide survey called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and it showed that there were more than 290,000 public middle and high school students who are caregivers in Florida. So at that same time, there were about 95,000 children of all ages who were homeless, and about 15,000 of all ages who were in foster care. So there's recognition and support for those, 110,000 students, but not for the 70 or so percent of caregiving youth. So that's what has to change.
I'm in agreement for sure.
Well, I'm certainly glad you are. And people don't know. You might see a child pushing somebody in a wheelchair, like even at Disney, and you don't think about, well, what happens when they get back to the room or home. You just don't think about children needing to be in that role.
Yes, and absolutely. I've spoken with a number of friends, colleagues in the recent past about AACY, and it's not something that was ever in their consciousness before. And that, oh, really? And so they start to think about that, and our conversation then evolves to similar to what you just said about a child pushing somebody in a wheelchair. And when I did use that example, and they said, oh, I just automatically thought that the parent was right there with them and not necessarily they were the ones who were responsible. It was very interesting.
Yeah, so, and the national data, that even the last data set, which was in 2020, that showed that there were about 5.4 million caregiving youth in our country, it excludes those who are in single parent homes, or who are being raised by grandparents, and then the grandparent gets sick. So we have a lot of work to do.
We do. So I'll segue that into the Caregiver Youth Bill of Rights. Can you tell us about that?
So that is something that was created in the UK. And so we took it and we adopted it for the United States. But we have adopted it. It's not been universally adopted. So another thing to work towards, that's for sure. Because children should have rights, It's our responsibility as adults to make sure that they're educated, and there are lots of things in place to make sure that that happens. But, do we not also have a responsibility to make sure that they can have their own life beyond caregiving?
Yes.
Like one boy said to me, what would our country do if there weren't caregiving youth?
That's a great question. It's a really powerful question.
Who would be providing care?
Right. When you look at a society that's already has a shortage.
Yeah. And that shortage isn't that shortage is expanding.
It is, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, it's growing for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, what, tell us a bit about, I want to understand this as well. Um, so how does the organization, we talked a little bit earlier about how it sustains itself financially, because I want anybody watching to understand this, and maybe you never know who's watching and who might want to help.
Right. So we have sought funding through grants, through individual donations, through fundraising efforts. And during the pandemic, that fundraising ability was reduced. And now with the economic influences, even the donations have diminished. And again, it's for some organizations, say like that deal with a specific disease, such say something familiar, such as cancer. So many people can relate to that. That it's easier to make a donation, for cancer research or cancer care when you don't know, you know, anything about caregiving youth. And so, we really have a broad responsibility. We were talking with one of our friends who's helped with some PR, and, we've had a lot of um, news attention, even on television, but that's a one-time thing, and so we haven't had that repetitive um, message going out, and I think that's one of the things that we really need to work on.
What would you say are, I have two more questions, and we've woven in and out of them, but maybe we can bring it back around. So what would you say are the ultimate goals of AACY?
Ultimate goal is that no child in our country should have to drop out of school because of caregiving responsibilities. That's it in a nutshell.
That's a big nutshell.
It is, but it can be done.
Yes. I like the fact that it is a big nutshell, meaning it, I like the goal. It's an goal that is, if we don't reach for the moon, you're never going to get there. I always believe I have both the dreamer side and the practicality side. And I always believe in going for the dream, and then you have the practicality side to make your way as far as possible, because if you don't reach for it, you're never going to come close.
Right. So we have some hope, if you will. So through the legislative office of Lois Frankel and others in Washington, we had the first ever Caregiving Youth Week resolution in Congress. In Florida, we're working on the Florida Caregiving Youth Act. We were hoping that that would move forward this session. It's not, only because there were some complications with the House sponsor. But right now there's a Senate Bill 654 with it. So we'll work hard to make sure it moves forward next session. And that way there's a model for other states to follow. We're also really encouraged by the work that we're doing with the folks in Rhode Island, because things work better if it's from the inside out than the outside in. Some folks in Rhode Island recognized that they needed to look at what's going on with the kids, and so that particularly in areas where high school graduation was an issue. And so they found more kids are working, and that's true also of caregiving youth with our economy, and more kids were caregiving. So they were looking at what can we do to support them. And so now there's legislation through the school district in Rhode Island to do that. So, it's neat to see that.
We talked a little bit earlier about how people, if they want to volunteer, how they can go through the website and contact Amanda. Are there other ways that people can get involved and help? Maybe they're one-off ways, or maybe they're recurring ways.
Yeah, well, maybe they know somebody who's a legislator that we can be introduced to. Maybe they belong to a group that we could do a webinar for, or, help their circle of influence and friends learn more about this population, and really be part of a movement that needs to begin on their behalf.
Yeah. Before we say goodbye to everybody, there's one thing that I've been saying to people more and more since I've become acquainted with AACY. I think I had mentioned to you in our first conversation, something that I've thought about. Oh, and actually, let's talk about that for a little bit, because I've thought about for a long time that when I was in middle school, we had woodshop and home economics, which is long gone, both of those, for the most part, not as a requirement. And I've always thought that, and especially over the past 5 years, that it'd be so powerful and so important if schools could have a class. I would love it to be mandatory, but even if they had a class that offered caregiving and patient advocacy so that children could understand and learn. Is there anything that goes on with that now or in the works?
So Dr. Lindsay, who was on the call that you were on, but who was not able to be at our advisory council meeting, he's a geriatrician who's become very interested in this, and he's at UVA. And so he is working to try and get this included in high school. But Todd, adult family caregivers, until they need to learn, it's not something that you go sign up for. And so, if we more normalize it, maybe that would help. And maybe if it's taught, but I'm not sure that it's something that if you don't use and you're not motivated to learn, that you would learn it.
That's a really good point. There's one thing I'll leave everybody with, and this is what I was alluding to earlier that I did not say, is that I've been telling people as it comes up, I'm certainly not just bringing it up, but as we talk about caregiving, and this is in life in general, I've been saying for a long time, you never know what's going on in somebody's life. So you just don't. You don't know what's going on in somebody's home. There's an outside view, and then we don't know what's going on. So when we see children, and if they are pushing a wheelchair, or if they are with their grandparent, or maybe not, maybe they're late for school, and we don't know why they're continually late for school. Maybe they didn't get a chance to do homework. Maybe they've pulled away from their friends, and so I always say, just keep an open mind, because we don't know what they're going through.
That is really true, Todd, and so important. And also, I think, in addition to educating the children in school, that we have to get this information in the curriculum of nursing professionals, of pediatricians, of educators, of legislators, so that because if you don't know what you don't know. And so, we have a gentleman who was at one of our schools who's a teacher, and he became a volunteer. And then the next year when he went to teach, he noticed that one of the kids in his class, that their shirt was like a little rumpled and they didn't look all put together. And he said normally he would have maybe had some prejudice against that child, but instead he looked at and talked to them about, what's going on. And so that's just so critical. We've had children be late for school and get detention because nobody knows that they're, taking their mom to dialysis before school.
Exactly. And I'm going to leave everybody with that powerful point, because it's really important. And I think it hits home to everybody, and it makes everybody hopefully pause for a moment. So I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to be a part of this organization. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for doing this and helping us grow and helping, more people understand a little bit more about Caregiving Youth.
My pleasure. The primary purpose of the podcast is to educate. While guests are invited to listen, listeners acknowledge that they are not being provided professional advice from the podcast or any guests. One Day, One Week and its sponsor, 17 Commerce LLC, expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast episodes or the information presented in the episodes.